All right, good afternoon, and welcome to the Model Rocketry presentation. Before the presentation gets started, we have a few administrative notes we'd like to give to you. First of all, for the conference, please visit the Illinois Wing website for more information on today's presenters and presentations. There's bios there, there's information about the presentations, so if you want to look at these later, you can do that after reading the information. Just a reminder, all times in the schedule are Central Time Zone, so at this point in the conference, if you haven't realized that, you've probably missed a lot of stuff. If you're attending the conference for CP credit for your professional development, complete the E&T survey at the end of the day, not at the end of each survey, at the end of the day, and you'll notice that link in the conference website. Only one survey is needed for the entire day, not after each session. And there will be 4 lucky attendants selected to receive a door prize of an Amazon gift card at the end of the day. You can register on the website to be eligible for that, and you can look up Saturday's winners on the website as well. Good luck to everybody on that. And also, finally, after the conference, you'll be receiving a feedback survey, so please take a few minutes to let us know what you thought about the conference, what we can do better, what went well, and what could have gone better. So with no further ado, we will begin our presentation that Lieutenant Nush is presenting on model rocketry. We've got no audio on the presentation.
Hello, I am First Lieutenant Bryon Nush, and I'll be giving the presentation on model rocketry. Some quick background on me first. I've been doing model rocketry pretty much ever since I was a kid. When I was in high school, I started a model rocketry club, and I very recently joined the National Association of Rocketry to get my level 1 high power rocket certification. On the CAP front, I joined CAP between my freshman and sophomore years of high school, and that was about 10 years ago. I'll be my 10th year of Stellar Patrol come May. During this presentation, we'll be going over the aerodynamics and motors, which lines up with stages 2 and 3 of the CAP model rocketry program. From there, we'll focus on techniques to building a model rocket, along with some common mistakes that happen and how we can avoid them, so that we can have successful launches. To start, we need to go over Newton's 3 laws of motion. Without them, we wouldn't be able to explain how rockets fly through the air and space and move the way they do. Newton's first law is on inertia. It states that a body in a state of rest and a body in motion tend to remain at rest or in a uniform motion unless acted upon by some outside force. So if I'm sitting, I'm going to remain sitting unless somebody pushes me. If I'm driving my car and let off the gas pedal, I'm going to be slowed down by the friction of the tires on the road and the drag from the air resistance. If I were out in space, I would keep moving until I hit something, or say a planet's gravity slows me down or speeds me up. Newton's second law states that the rate of change in the momentum of a body is proportional to the force acting upon the body in the direction of that force. This is commonly summed up in the formula F equals ma, where F is the force, m is the mass, and a is the acceleration. If we have mass accelerating at a certain rate, that means a force of F was applied to it. And Newton's third law is probably the most well-known of these three. It states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If I push on a wall, the wall pushes back on me with the same amount of force, but in the opposite direction. For rockets, we need to know about two very important centers. The first of those is most likely to be familiar with us and is called the center of gravity. The center of gravity is the point where all mass is perfectly balanced. That point is also where objects will rotate around when in free space. This can be seen in the picture labeled Figure 1. If we look at Figure A, we have a uniform stick that rotates around its halfway point. Since the stick is of uniform thickness, its center of gravity is at that halfway point. If we were to add mass to one end, as you see in Figure B of that picture, the center of gravity changes to be closer to that mass. And we can see in Figure C that it's no longer balancing at the halfway point of that stick, it's balancing closer to that mass because the center of gravity moved. If we want to find the center of gravity of an object, we just have to find where it balances at. So with our rocket, we can do this by tying a string to it and looking where it balances on that string, as we can see in the picture on the right. The next very important center is the center of pressure. If center of gravity is where mass is balanced on an object, center of pressure is where the force of moving air is balanced on an object. This is generally hard to find without special equipment. Most of the time you need a wind tunnel. For our model rockets, though, we can make do without a wind tunnel. We can approximate the center of pressure by finding the center of gravity of the cardboard cutout instead. So if we look over at the pictures, in the top left picture, we find the center of gravity of our rocket. From there, we make a cardboard cutout of our rocket and find its center of gravity, and that's what we see in Figure B. We then measure where the cardboard center of gravity is at and mark that on our actual rocket. So if we look at Figure 3C, we just measured where the center of pressure was at on the cardboard cutout and just mapped it to our actual rocket. And that will give us an approximation of where our center of pressure is at for a rocket. So we know about center of gravity and center of pressure. What's so important about them when it comes to our rockets? Well, the importance of them is that it makes our rocket stable. If we don't have a stable rocket, it will fly erratically and out of control. While it might be fun to watch, it can be dangerous and cause damage to people and property. So to have a stable rocket, our center of gravity must be in front of the center of pressure. For our model rockets, a stable design will have a center of gravity generally about half a caliber in front of the center of pressure. What's a caliber? A caliber is just another name for diameter. If we have a rocket by a tube with a diameter of 1 inch, our caliber will also be 1 inch. Keeping with this example of a 1 inch diameter rocket, if we want the center of gravity to be ½ inch in front of the center of pressure, which is what half of a caliber would be, if we look at the picture, so we want our center of gravity to be about ½ an inch in front of our center of pressure if we have a 1 inch diameter rocket. And so if we look at this picture on the right, we have the axes of motion all going through the center of gravity, and then we have a small arrow at the rear or aft end of the rocket, which shows where the center of pressure should be. And then this slide is just showing the forces that can act on a rocket while it is in motion. On the left and right, we have rockets that are flying at an angle. When flying at an angle, the body tube and fins generate lift, which moves the rocket into a more vertical flight. It's not explicitly pictured here, but there's also some Newton's third, or just Newton's law of action going on in general at the center of pressure. The moving air will push on the more exposed side of that tilted rocket, and this uneven pushing on one side instead of the other will help straighten our rocket too, and it's part of that blue lift arrow. So we know about center of gravity and center of pressure and why they're so important. How can we change them if we need to make our rockets more stable? Well, it's fairly easy. For center of gravity, we just need to add weight to the forward end. To be efficient with weight and benefit from leverage, we're going to want to put that weight as far forward as possible. So this can be done by putting clay inside the nose cone, or if we don't have a hollow nose cone or a way to put clay inside the nose cone, we can glue washers to the base of the nose cone. For center of pressure, the trick is we just need to add more surface area. And again, this benefit from that idea of leverage, like with center of gravity, we want to add more surface area to as far to the rear or aft end of that rocket as possible. This can be done by making the fins bigger or by simply adding more fins. So now that we talked about the aerodynamics of rockets, let's talk more specifically about the motors that we'll put in them. Model rocket motor fuel is usually either black powder or composite based. For Civil Patrol, we'll be using the Estes motors, which are black powder rocket motors. The motors contain almost everything they need. The package itself will contain the igniters, but that's not the self-contained cutout that I have on the right side here. So if we look at the picture on the right side here of a cutout, the bottom contains a ceramic nozzle. Moving up from there, we have our solid fuel, and right above that, we have the delay. The delay will give our rocket time to coast so it can get more altitude without needing to be powered. And during this coasting phase, we'll also be releasing dark tracking smoke to make our rocket easier to see in the sky. Once the delay goes through, the ejection charge is ignited, which releases hot gas. This hot gas will then push on our recovery wadding, parachute, and nose cone, which will hopefully pop the nose cone and deploy the parachute. We'll talk about what happens if those don't happen in the mishaps section. So when we're looking at motors, if we look at our packet of motors, we're going to see some nomenclature with these motors. And it can be a little confusing at first, but we're going to break down what this nomenclature is. So the nomenclature is divided into three sections. We have a letter, we have a number, and then we have another number after the dash. So the letter is the impulse or power class. Motors are divided into classes based on the total impulse, and each preceding one will have twice the total impulse as the preceding class. And so if we look at the picture on the right, we have at the very left a half A size motor or impulse power class motor, and that has an impulse of about 1.25 Newton seconds. From there, we have A, which tops out at 2.5 Newton seconds, and then we have B that tops out at 5 Newton seconds, and so on. So for after the power class, we have the next number represents the average thrust, and that just tells us the average thrust of that motor measured in newtons. So if we're looking at this, we go, we have a B6-4 as our example here, but B class has a total impulse of 5, and the average thrust it's saying is 6. How is that possible? The key thing to remember here is that the power class is measuring impulse, while average thrust is a measure of force. So there are two different types of units. So that's why we can have a thrust that's higher than our power class, because they don't map one-to-one. So after that, we have the final number, which is after the dash, which is the delay. And the delay is measured in seconds, and it just says how long before the ejection charge fires after that power phase, after where our rocket is lit. And so it's measured in seconds, and if there's a 0 at the end, that means it's a booster motor, and it would be the first motor that's lit in a multi-stage rocket. And this is just a quick thrust chart showing, before we had an example, we were looking at B6 engine, which we have a thrust chart on the right. And if we have a slightly lower thrust engine, but still in the B power class, which is the B4 on the left, we can see that the B4, its average power is, looking at the chart, is around that 3 mark, it's slightly above that 3 mark. Or, well, it's a 4 because of what the second number in the B4 is. But we can see that the time that it lasts is a lot longer. It's a little over 1 second compared to the B6 engine, where it doesn't even get to 1 second. And that's because it pushes out a lot more force faster compared to the B4 engine. And we need to still stay in that power class of a B engine of 5 Newton seconds, so it can't last as long. So from there, some quick construction techniques of when making model rockets. For the glue, we'll generally want to use wood glue or white glue. Those will be powerful and strong enough for our rockets to not fall apart in flights. One of the things I like to do is glue when initially gluing the fins on, because they For me, I find it cures faster, so I don't have to hold the fin to the rocket body tube for the 10 or so minutes that takes for white glue or wood glue to dry. The super glue will dry a lot faster, which can just, for me, I find it easier and more convenient when assembling rockets. Next technique, if we want to go for altitude to make our rockets more streamlined, is we can round the fins. We can round the leading edges, or really any edge that's not connected to the rocket. We can round and sand to make it more aerodynamic. So if we look at the picture on the right, there are 3 different kinds of ways that we can sand or round them. The first one is rounded, then we have streamlined, and then we have double wedge. While the 2 on the right will be more aerodynamic, generally, especially for beginners, it's recommended to do the rounded because if you mess up, it won't create as much drag as the other 2. It is a lot more forgiving if we go with a rounded, if we round our fins rather than trying to straighten or do the double wedge. And the next little helpful tip when building these is we want to make sure when aligning the fins that we put the fins on along the longitudinal axis to line up with the body tube. We don't want to put them at angles because that will cause our rocket to curve and not fly in a straight path. And so a quick way to mark tubes when doing our fin guide is we can, or to straighten out to draw lines instead of using a ruler, trying to balance a ruler on our model rocket tube, is if you have a door frame nearby, you can just put the rocket up against the door frame and use that as your ruler or straight edge to draw a straight line, and again, not have to worry about balancing a ruler on a rounded rocket tube. If we want to go more advanced, after we have the fins on, we can make what are called fin fillets. And that's what's on the bottom picture here is once the fin is attached, you just add glue to that joint or seam. And you make it on both sides of the fin to make it just a lot more, to make that connection, that joint a lot stronger. For our low power rockets that we do, it's not gonna have much of an effect in flight because we're doing low power rocketry. The white glue on its own will keep the fin secure during flight. But what I find is this is helpful more for after the rocket is landed. If you throw the rocket in the car, the balsa fins tend to pop off if the connection isn't strong. So having fin fillets will make it after the launch in between flights just be a lot stronger. If we get into mid-power or high-power rocketry, fin fillets will be a lot more useful just due to the forces that a rocket experiences from those higher power motors. And then being really advanced, if we want to make sure our rocket fins are as straight as possible, we can make a jig out of cardboard. We just take a piece of cardboard, if you have old cardboard from Amazon boxes or something, you just outline the tube in that cardboard and cut it out, and you can use the supplied fin guide that comes with your rocket to mark where the fins go. And then from there, you just cut perpendicular with the length and width of the fin, and now you have a jig that you can use that you can slide over the rocket and use to secure the fins in place. And that's what the picture in the top right is showing. The fins will stay in place even without glue, and this makes it very easy because then you can just glue your fins and then walk away. You don't have to hold the fins on as you would if you didn't have a fin jig. And the other thing you want to do is when you're making this is you want to leave space around the tube, like where it's close to the fin root, so you don't glue that cardboard fin jig along with the fins, because then it gets messy having to pull the cardboard away from the rocket body tube. And that's not pictured in this in the top right picture. You just leave a little gap around where the fins meet the fin root is in the cardboard. So we've built our rocket. What do we need to actually launch? Well, we need a launch pad. We need a launch controller with batteries because our system is lit using electricity. And then we'll need recovery wadding because those do not come with our motors. And then we'll need our actual motors. If you buy a pack of motors, they will come with igniters inside them, with electrical igniters that we can connect to our launch controller. And so when we're prepping these rockets, what we want to do is we want to put 3 to 4 squares of recovery wadding in the rocket. The recovery wadding's purpose is so that when the hot ejection gases come, once the motor is done, it fires off the ejection charge. Those gases coming off are very hot. The recovery wadding will protect our parachute so that it doesn't melt or singe. So once we put the recovery wadding inside the rocket, we're going to want to lightly wrap the shroud lines and the shock cord, which is in smaller rockets is usually a rubber band, around the parachute. From there, we're going to insert the igniter and plug into the motor. You can either put the igniter into the motor first, or you can put the motor into the rocket first and then add the igniter. But you're going to want to, but at some point you're going to need the igniter and the plug in the motor, because the plug is going to hold the igniter in when you flip the rocket back to put on the launch rod. So once we have the motor in the rocket with the igniter and plug, we're going to slide that rocket onto the launch pad via the launch lug. And the launch lug is just a little, it looks like a straw, it looks like a little plastic straw that's on the side of the rocket. And that's where the launch rod will go through. And you'll attach the launch controller clips, and then you'll just follow the instructions for whatever kind of controller you have to count down at launch. And if you have an Estes rocket controller, it'll look similar to what I have here. This is copy and pasted from one of the Estes rocket instructions, where basically it goes through the same process of you have a key. The controller usually has a key of some sort, but you'll take anything that's on top of the launch rod, you'll take off so you can actually add the rocket to it, which is what's showing in steps 2. You'll slide the rocket onto that launch pad, attach the clips, and then once you'll walk away to wherever you have that launch controller at. You'll push the key in to see a light to make sure that everything's actually connected properly. If you don't see a light, that most likely means that your clips aren't connected to the igniter properly. And you'll just count down, push the key in, and push the button at the same time, and your rocket will hopefully launch. So let's talk about some mishaps, especially during the construction phase. What I've seen my cadets do is they've sometimes not followed the directions correctly, and they've put the shock cord mount, they didn't glue it properly, or they didn't add it at all, because it's in the instructions, it's a piece of paper that you have to cut out, and if you haven't done it before, it can be confusing to know that that's an actual part of the rocket that you have to add. It's not just a ruler or guide. So if the shock cord isn't mounted, what happens is the rocket goes up, the ejection phase happens, the parachute and nose cone go off in one direction, your rocket body comes off in another direction, and they fall separately, and you don't, if you're following the CAP Model Rocketry program to get the Model Rocketry badge, that doesn't qualify as one of your launches that doesn't qualify for the badge. You have to do another launch because you can't have the parachute separate. Another thing that happens, which is very similar, is they don't connect the nose cone to the shock cord. They'll attach the parachute to the shock cord, but they won't actually tie the shock cord itself to the nose cone. So what happens is a similar thing, except instead of the parachute being attached to the nose cone flies off separately, and the rocket body comes down with the parachute. And now you have a lost nose cone. And the third construction mistake that I've seen people make is with our rocket motor tubes, when we're building them, there's a retainer ring that's put inside the motor tube. And what that is that when you ignite the motor, this is what stops the motor from going straight through the rocket all the way to the nose cone and just continuing. This stops it and keeps it inside that engine mount bay. And so what happens is the retainer will be glued in correctly to the right spot, but then people will flip it when they're inserting it, and what happens is you can't insert the motor anymore, because the part that was supposed to stop it from going through the motor or through the rocket will now stop the motor from just being inserted into the rocket in general. So that was construction mishaps. Now, pre-launch mishaps is what usually happens, or what can happen, is little or no recovery wadding is used. And I kind of mentioned this before, but if little or no recovery wadding is used, what happens is our plastic parachutes get melted from the hot ejection gases, and they no longer work. The rocket just falls like a rock. Another issue that happens is parachutes get jammed in the rocket, and when they get jammed in the rocket, the ejection charge goes off, but the nose cone doesn't pop off. What can happen there is either the end result is going to be that the rocket lawn darts. It goes ballistic. This is probably one of the most dangerous situations that can happen with a rocket, because it's like an arrow. But what can happen is, either the nose cone doesn't pop off and everything just stays contained, or what can happen is that the ejection gases blow a hole in the side of your rocket, so no longer is your rocket your rocket is still a lawn dart, but once you pick it up after it hopefully lands safely, you can't reuse it because now there's a giant hole in the side of the rocket. Another pre-launch failure that happens is the igniter is not inserted all the way into the rocket or into the motor, or it's crossed before, or the wires touch before that ignition point. So if we look over at the right here, we see in the very bottom right corner, or it's on the right below the colored picture of the rocket showing the jam parachute. What happens is that at the very tip where it says thin wire bridge, that has to be the only point where the wires touch, where that H-shaped wires touch. If they touch before that, what happens is electricity travels across it then in two places, and that thin bridge wire doesn't get all the electrical power, so it doesn't heat up as hot. And if it doesn't heat up as hot, it's not going to ignite our motor. So now, if that happens, what you have to do is you have to replace the igniter, because the igniter is only single use. So if they get if they misfire like that, you have to replace the igniter. And usually, when you buy the motors, the packet comes in will come with multiple igniters, or more than the 3 igniters. Because the packets usually come with 3 motors, they'll come with more than 3 igniters in case there's a misfire. And then the final pre-launch mishap that I've seen happen is the booster motor gets switched with the upper stage. So if you remember, we were talking about motors, the motors that end with a 0. So if it's like a B6-0, those are booster motors. There is no delay. The ejection charge goes off right away. And it's that ejection charge in a 2-stage rocket. It's the ejection charge that sets off the second motor. And so if we look at the bottom, these are instructions I copied from the rocket instruction guide. They show you tape the motors together. That one on the very left where you'll be inserting the plug in, that's the one you'll want to be the booster motor. If you switch them around and make it the main motor as the first one that launches, what will happen is the rocket will go up, and the trailing charge, or the tracking smoke will go, the delay charge will go, and so the ejection charge hasn't gone yet. The rocket will reach apogee and will start facing downwards. And while it's facing downwards, the ejection charge will go off, setting off the second motor, and that basically turns our model rockets into bunker busters, which again, not safe. Kind of fun to watch, but not safe if there's someone underneath it or people, property. We want to avoid that. And because your rocket will definitely be destroyed at the end, and there will be no recovery for that rocket. So those are the kind of mishaps that happen with pre-launches. They're simple to fix, but if you don't inspect the rockets beforehand, it can just end up being a waste of material, because if we're having to replace rockets or having to replace igniters. And that's the end of our presentation. If there's any questions, you can go ahead and ask them. All right, so looking at our chat, I see that there are some questions. First one by Cadet Airman First Class Ezra Morass. I am hearing some feedback. I don't know if that's just on my end. Give me a second. All right, so going with the questions. So as Captain Wenzel commented, in most of our rockets, it will be liquid oxygen. Or in most commercial rockets that go into space, it will be liquid oxygen. Because what we need for the majority of our rockets is they're powered through combustion. And with combustion, we need oxygen. As you're asking, like, there's no air in space. How can we have combustion if there's no air? So what happens, as Captain Wenzel says, is that we bring it with us. Most of the rockets, such as what SpaceX uses, what the Space Shuttle uses, the Russian Soyuz rockets, all those will use liquid oxygen because they're liquid fuel powered rockets. But with our motors, a lot of the rockets too from smaller rocket companies are very similar to what our model rocket motors are, in that the model rocket motors are solid fuel motors, and solid fuel motors combine both fuel and oxygen. So either way, we're bringing it with us. It just depends on the type of fuel, whether it's if it's a liquid rocket, fueled rocket, we bring a liquid oxygen with us. If it's a solid rocket, we bring the oxygen with us in the form of an oxidizer. So both ways, we got to bring the air with us, because we need air for our combustion rockets. Satellites are a little different because there are some satellites that go off their ion engines. I forget exactly how those work because I don't look into satellites much, but they're powered more through same thing. We're just like the regular rockets where we're pushing stuff out the end,
but it's a lot smaller. It's not hot gases like rockets, or with the rockets that we're used to. So excellent question there, Cadet Airman Ezra Mares. The next question I saw is, what is material you should, from Cadet Senior Airman S. Troyer, what is the material you should stay away from when making fins? Basically, you can use any kind of material for making rocket fins. I have in the back, if you can see it, I have that's my qualification rocket for my high power cert that I'm going for. Those fins are made out of plywood. It was a kit, and it's I want to say it's 1/8" plywood. I have another rocket here where it's also plywood. It's a little bigger rocket, so they keep it with stronger wood of plywood. A lot of the SS starter rockets will be made out of balsa wood. I've made rockets out of cardboard paper, or just like corrugated cardboard, so like from a cereal box or an Amazon box. You can just cut that out and use those for fins. You can pretty much use anything that you want for rocket fins. The main thing you want to avoid is metal. And the reason we want to avoid metal is because it's a lot stronger. So in cases of mishaps, it will do a lot more damage than a paper or wood-based fins. And the National Association of Rocketry, in their code, forbids using metal in rockets for those reasons. And then let's see, the other question by Cadet Senior Airman S. Troyer is a half spearhead or a point head better on a rocket? I don't know exactly what you mean by those. That sounds like they're arrowheads of some sort. With a rocket in general, you're going to want I'll bring this back out. You're going to want a rounded tip of some sort. So like if you do going with arrowheads, the basic for like target practice arrows, you would want basic, just a pointed tip. You don't want anything flat because then you're generating lift unevenly. If the rocket tilts, it's not gonna. There's more forces at play. And if you look at rockets such as like the Space Shuttle, Falcon 9, they're all rounded tips. The nose cones of those aren't flat in any way. Let's see. Next question is from Cadet Airman First Class Ezra Mares. Do some blow up? For our model rockets, we can have mishaps. There are different kind of mishaps. One is called a CATO, or a catastrophic failure. And what happens with that is sometimes, very, very rarely, but our model rocket motors can malfunction, can be deformed in certain ways if you store them improperly, and they're exposed to very high heat and very cold temperatures. The material inside will expand, create bubbles or cracks. Basically, it'll explode. And when it explodes, you'll most likely lose, depending on how big your rocket is, but you could destroy your rocket from there. Let's see, from Second Lieutenant Bruce Rubin, have you seen that winds can cause igniter to fail to ignite the motor? So winds aren't going, from what I've seen, the winds don't cause failures to ignite because, let me see if I can, let me open up my packet of rockets or motors right here that I have. So with our igniters, how they work, with the solid ones, or it's a little different for composite motors, which they use on higher power rockets. With our solid ones, they're from SS, which will for low power, mid power that we'll be using. The igniter, it goes all the way in. So once it's all the way in, it's going to be very hard for wind to get there. And it's going to be heat that's generated off the tip of these igniters that ignites it. So I haven't seen wind cause failures to ignite in terms of this. What can happen is that if you don't have, let me pull the plug out. What can happen is if you don't, so when you install the igniter, you put a little plastic plug in there. If you get SS motors, it comes in the pack. You can kind of see this is where the motors were, and the igniters are in the side part at the top here. And so it'll come with the igniters and the plugs are what secure it, so that, like I'm knocking on this right now, it's not falling out. If you have the plugs in, it's going to be very hard for the wind to interfere in this process, because the rest of it is just electrical currents going through the wires to ignite the compound on the end. Let's see. Another question from Cadet Airman First Class Ezra Maris. How does it push against no air? So how rockets work in space is it's off this idea of conservation of momentum. So what happens is right now, like this motor has a certain amount of mass in it. And when we go to ignite this, mass is going to go out one way. And with conservation of momentum, what happens is basically the net momentum has to remain the same. So if we have momentum going out this way in this direction, I'm going to say to my right because this is how I'm presenting it to my right. So if we're going to have the hot gases go out to the right, well, to follow the laws of conservation of momentum, you got to have an equal amount going out on the left, and that's what causes our rocket to go and to accelerate in space because there is no air to push against. Because even when it's launching from the ground, it's not really pushing against the air. It's this idea of conservation of momentum, and it's that and Newton's third law of, Newton's third law kind of plays in the conservation of momentum. So that's how it pushes against with no air. What speeds are the rockets traveling in? Oh, that's an excellent question because I need to know that for when I go to get my high power certification. This is one thing that I actually failed at for the initial part. We're just in the beforehand talking online with some of the instructors. It depends on the rocket. That's you asked the one question that's very bad for because that's fine to know. It'll generally be about. It depends on the rocket. They can go faster than Mach. If you get for most of the rockets, they're not going to go anywhere near the speed of sound. They will very fast would be like 200 miles per hour. For ours, they'll be closer to like 15, 20 miles per hour leaving off the pad. Let's see. So what speed are the rockets traveling in? Let's see. Next one. Let's see. From Lieutenant Colonel Hain. Have you used a small amount of baby powder to help the chute slide out? So I haven't used what I use instead of baby powder. Just when it comes before I launch the rockets, is I'll use this as an example. So right now, if you're going to go for a rocket launch, the way you don't want to have your rocket stored the night before is you don't want to store it all assembled and packed in, because what happens is the plastic is going to stick together. So what I do is before the actual launch, the night before, I will unroll everything, and the parachute itself, I will have I will have unfurled. That way, it's not there's no. It's that way. It's easier for it to come out of the rocket. There are people though who they do use baby powder or talcum powder to coat it. That's a very valid. That's a good way to stop your rocket from sticking. For me, that just hasn't been a problem that I've found or I've had in general. For me, it's just making sure that it's unfurled the night before, or at least right before the or going to the launch, that it's not all packed together, has been enough for me to keep the parachute from getting stuck or from unfurling. Because most of the problems that I've seen when people have parachute issues has been either they pack it too tight in the tube to where they don't fold it properly, to where they're pretty much stuffing it in. Like something like this would be bad because it will get stuck. Or the other issue that they've had that I've seen is when they go to fold it, they fold it properly, but what happens is, give me a second to fold this. But what happens is, so part of the steps is you wrap the shroud lines around the parachute. The other thing I have seen is people wrap them too tight, and to where the rocket goes up, but it's so tight that the parachute can't unfurl from the wind, just from it falling. So those are more of the two bigger issues I've seen. Which rocket, from Major Williams, which rocket would you recommend for the very first model rocket project? So Estes has this rocket. It's called the Alpha, and what is it's a how do I explain it? When you think of a model rocket, the Alpha is pretty much the first kind of rocket you think of. It's 4 fins. It's balsa fins, a cardboard tube, a plastic nose cone. There is a rocket Estes creates called the Alpha 3. That one is more of pre-made parts or pre-made plastic parts. So the fins are plastic. The bottom part of the fins are that they're actually plastic. You don't have to glue them on. It's because they're built in the tube. I personally wouldn't recommend. If it depends on the kids. If it's older kids, I would go with the regular Alpha because for me, gluing the fins on is an important step for me, just to get that experience of when you go to larger rockets. If it's younger kids or something like boredom of having to hold the fin in is younger kids, short attention spans or whatever, that's where the Alpha 3 would be better because the fins are all attached. Doing the fins for me, I think is the hardest part of actually building a rocket because you want to get them on so that they're that perfect. If it's a 4-fin rocket, so that they're that perfect T shape and that they're not crooked or sideways. Let's see, from Lieutenant Colonel Han, when using the small handheld launch controllers, special 9-volt batteries are required to provide enough amps to ignite the motor. Yes, for the ESTAs, you'll want 9-volt batteries, and 9-volt batteries are charged because they do require a lot of wattage power going through those wires to actually ignite those igniter tips, which one of them I seem to have lost. Yeah, so there's a certain amount of amperage is required for the ESTAs. Some of the electron beam controllers that ESTAs has, those actually use AA's, and what they do is they connect them in, I think it's 3. I think they connect them in series. They're connected in a way to where they can provide enough power because yeah, a single AA is not going to ignite these igniters. They need a little more power. And if you go up to more mid-power rocketry or high-power rocketry, that's where you're going to need a 12-volt system where people are generally connected to a car battery because it's going to need a lot more power than just these low igniters. Thank you, Cadet Seniorman Troyer. Thank you. How many Gs is the pilot subject to? And that's what Tech Sergeant Marcus asked that. I don't know how many Gs the test pilot or pilots in general, astronauts are subjected to when going through space. I'm more on the model rocketry side. I follow SpaceX and them a little bit, but I don't know right now to tell you the numbers off the top of my head what they go through. I know for like fighter pilots, they generally tend to top out at around 6 Gs because if you give a lot of Gs for too long, you can black out. So there are limits, and people in general are allowed limitations when it comes to how fast we can make something go, which is why right now lots of militaries around the world, especially the U.S. Air Force, we're looking at drones, and that's because if we don't have people inside the aircraft or the rocket, it can do a lot more maneuvers, go a lot faster than if we have a person inside. Cadet Airman First Class Ezra Maris, tell me about the one behind me. Let me grab it quickly. So as you can see, this is from the picture. It's almost as tall as me. It's a 5.5-foot tall rocket. This definitely not for beginners. You need to go through, or you want a few rockets under your belt before actually going something high power. It's 5.5-foot rocket. The diameter is 4 inches. This weighs about 5 pounds. Different from most rocket, or when you go bigger rockets, they will separate from the center instead of the nose cone just because they're so big. So it separates from the center. There's not really, between this and a regular ESTA's Alpha, there isn't much of a difference between it. It's just this is bigger, it's stronger, more reinforced. This has a metal eye bolt for the cord because this will be going through a lot more weight once the ejection charge and parachute comes out compared to like an ESTA's Alpha. But the main things with this is this will use a composite motor. I actually have the motor over on the side that I can pull out to show you just what it looks like compared to a ESTA's rocket. But this is pretty much the same thing as, again, there's not much difference between that and a small like ESTA's Alpha. It's just stronger, more reinforced. It weighs more, so you need a bigger motor. The motor for that looks like this, a lot bigger compared to our little B64 over here. This is an H100. So this one puts out an average of 6 newtons of thrust. This puts out 100 newtons of thrust, which I think there's a conversion chart on here somewhere. But it's basically a few pounds a second. This is saying, so yeah, so this is going to put 30 pounds of thrust on average when this is ignited. So imagine, and this is why you want, and going with this is why high power, you don't want to start off right away in high power because you know the safety and the physics behind it. If you have a large rocket like this being propelled with 13 pounds of force a second, and that this will go through a car. This will go through a car's windshield. It's just it's dangerous. So you want to make sure that you know things behind it so that you're launching rockets in a very safe way. Because especially like the National Association of Rocketry, they're very big on safety. Safety is the main reason why, like this, you have to be certified to buy. A regular Joe Schmo can't go to the hobby store and buy these. These have to be special ordered, and they have to be specially shipped to do just the amount of propellant that they have. It's considered hazmat. Adults had to sign off for it. It's because these are very dangerous, and you want to make sure that they're in the right hands and that the people using them understand them. So that's Cadet Airman First Class, excellent question about the rocket behind me. What triggered my interest in model rocketry? And that was by Cadet Senior Airman S. Troyer. When I was growing up, my brothers were launching model rockets. So I mean, I was exposed to it from a very young age, and it's one of those things where I like to build things, and I like to build things. I like aerospace. I'm a software engineer right now. In high school, I thought I was going to be an aerospace engineer. I went through most of high school thinking that I was going to be an aerospace engineer, and naturally, rockets, something I can build, is what I gravitated towards. I also did RC planes. I did RC planes from kits. So just building things in general and something in the air is what draws me. And so it being a rocket and just all together, I think rockets are cool. Space is amazing, and so it's just something that I come back. I can do more and more with it. I find that the more I do. And then so in high school, my brothers launched it when I was young. And in high school, I was part of Air Force Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps, AFJROTC, and they're wanting to start a rocket club. And so since I've had experience, I volunteered to help lead that, and that was kind of that regained my interest just because I had experience from when I was younger, and then when it was high school, more people wanted to do it, and I was kind of the expert in the field because I've done it before. So that rekindled my interest in model rocketry. For Major Curtis, do you have a favorite or better success with certain models? In general, it's I have had some failures. It's behind the wall. It's behind some stuff, so I can't get it right now. But I have had failures of rockets, parachutes failing to launch, or most of my failures have been in terms of just that ejection phase where the rocket body comes, the rocket nose cone comes off, the tube separates. So it's never been something like construction failures for me. It's usually been like right before I launch, some prep failure. So here, let me look back at your question. Do you have a favorite better success with certain models? So it's not, so generally when you buy a kit, the kits are going to, they're going to be standard kits of some sort where multiple people have built and launched them. The people who sell them, they come from companies, like brand name companies. So it's not going to be any failure in the design. It's going to be more of either like just construction. The failures, the cash rocket failures have been related to parachutes for me. The failures I have happened have been after it's landed. I have had fins pop off. So when I was talking about those fin fillets, it's kind of hard. It's going to be very hard to see on this camera with this, but I've made sure you can kind of see. I've used wood glue, so you can see that this is a white tube, but there's yellow around the fins. So I've made sure that I've done fin fillets because I've had rockets either they land on the ground on asphalt and the fins have popped off, or I'm down at the launch field and I put them in my car, and on the way back home, because they're rattling in the back, fins have popped off. So those have been more of the failures I've had, but it hasn't been any issues with the models themselves. It's been usually construction or prep failure of some sort. Okay, and then Google says the astronauts experienced about 3 Gs during liftoff. So I didn't know that. I would have thought it would have been a lot higher, but that's awesome to know. Yeah, good point. I have not to keep the parachutes rolled up. What mishaps have I had by Cadet Airman First Class Ezra Maris? I kind of just talked about because I didn't get this question, but yeah, it's usually been either parachutes have been jammed in, or not jammed. It's my issue's been because I know not to jam it, so I've tried to tightly wrap the cords around the parachute, and where it's too tight, the parachute won't unfurl. So it's either been those mishaps, or it's been, like I said before, with the fins popping up. I wouldn't really consider it a mishap, just more of like, there's been before where, like going with these, I've had misfires where the igniter wasn't plugged in all the way. So when I went to launch it, the igniter ignited, and the igniter got used up, but the actual motor didn't launch. And if I were to look inside and like pull the plug out and look, I could see there's a little charred part that didn't actually ignite. So I've had misfires, and that's probably the most common thing for me, or when I'm helping others, because I'll walk people through how to do it. But it's very finicky with these wires. Let me take the plug out. Again, I don't know how well this is going to look over a webcam, but it's very hard. It's very easy for just to make these wires touch before the tip, because you don't want the wires to touch before the tip. If they touch before the tip, you're not going to have all the power go through the tip. It's going to become a parallel circuit, and so it's going to go through both. And there's basically, like we said before, we need, like for our SS, we want a 9-volt battery. If you split, then you don't have all the power going to the tip. Now you have that power split 2 ways, and it's like you're not using a 9-volt battery. Let's see, Lieutenant Colonel Haynes talking about batteries such as Fuji Enviromax, Energizer Max, Rayovac Ultra Pros, or Everready Copper Tops. I don't have any brand loyalty when it comes to batteries. It's just whatever ones I happen to have lying around. I do, before I use them though, I do take a multimeter to them to make sure that they actually are good batteries and they're not dead. So if we're talking about regular alkaline batteries, those want to be at 1.5 volts, somewhere around 1.5 volts tells you they're new. If it's a 9-volt battery, you're going to want them around 9 volts. If you're using rechargeable batteries, those are going to be, they're charged at 1.3 volts. So generally, I make sure that the batteries are charged beforehand. And if I'm doing a mid-power or high-power rocket launch to where I'm using my homemade controller, where basically part of it is just connecting to a car battery, the night before I go through and I make sure everything's working. I do a test run where I connect it to the car battery, because I use my car's battery because it's just the simplest thing. I don't have to go buy another 12-volt car battery. But I will go through the whole process, connect the battery to the launch controller, and I'll have my multimeter at the end instead of igniter to make sure that I'm getting the voltages that I would expect. Because if maybe there's a short or something, then I would expect, because I would expect to see 12 volts, but if there's a short or something's wrong, you either hear sparks because it's a short and something's not working right, or the multimeter will read less than 12 volts, and that tells me, hey, something's loose. And so that will help with a lot of, like if you go to launch and you go, it's not launching. Well, okay, I know the battery's good because it's 12 volts, so maybe I'm not actually connected. Because that's actually very common for me. A common issue I've had with launches, especially with my 12 volts when mid-power launches, because I'm very safe around the 12-volt batteries because that will hurt, and you don't want to short anything out. So I have it disconnected in multiple places, and right before I launch is when I will connect everything, and sometimes I'll forget one part where it's connected, or like a little switch I didn't flip. So going back to what kind of mishaps that I had or failures, not making sure everything was connected right before has been other issues that just that one extra step that I forgot, or that one little thing that wasn't connected. Oh, and Lieutenant Colonel Haynes says those are the batteries that SS recommends because they have the good systems. Let's see. Lieutenant Colonel Haynes says he learned about the batteries from a bad day at the launch field. I guess I kind of stick to brand batteries because those are, well, most of my launches been when I was living at home because I moved recently, and so most of the batteries that we've had at home have been brand batteries like the Duracell, the Rayovac, or they've been like the Costco, Sam's Club brands they're brand batteries that have been relabeled to based on just that build process when they build the batteries. Has a rocket I've launched ever exploded? From Cadet Steer Airman S. Troyer. I have not had a motor explode. All my failures have just been related to the parachutes, and either parachute not coming out or the parachute comes out but it's so wound that it doesn't deploy. Have you used rechargeable batteries from Tech Sergeant Marcus? So I have not. I've generally with when I'm doing Estes, I'll use 9-volt batteries. The Estes, they call it the electron beam controller, is their brand of like that starter launch controller. Those do take AA's, but I haven't used AA or rechargeables in there. The main reason I don't use rechargeables is because rechargeables lose their charge over time. An alkaline, like a regular alkaline battery won't. Their shelf life is a lot longer. So I'm a lazy person. I don't charge the batteries right before I go on the field. Like if it's rechargeable, like that's the main reason why I don't use rechargeables, is because there's that extra step of you have to recharge the batteries. If it's a regular Duracell, and that's why I just go to check the voltages beforehand. If we go with when I do mid-power, high-power, I haven't done a high-power launch yet because of weather and COVID. But when I do my mid-power launches, that's with a car battery that's technically rechargeable, but you're not going to have the same issues. And it looks like we're wrapping up now. So thank you all for the questions and for your interest in model rocketry and for seeing through this presentation. And just